When a massively anticipated final season of a beloved franchise turns way worse, sparking just widespread criticism and, maybe most damningly, drawing these direct comparisons to the infamous catastrophic collapse of Game of Thrones, you just have to ask what exactly went wrong in that script.
Yeah, what happened? How do you get to a point where your most anticipated moments are being called, and this is a real quote, the cringiest moments in the entirety of cinema itself?
It's an incredible fall from grace, and that is exactly the mission of our deep dive today. We've gone through just stacks of sources, everything from really nuanced fan theories to, frankly, outright vitriol about Stranger Things Season 5, Volume 2.
We're basically performing an autopsy on the script here. We're looking at why viewers felt these huge dramatic shifts in, writing quality, pacing, character relevance, everything.
Right. We need to understand the architectural failure. What happens when a story that was built on the strength of its core relationships suddenly finds those same relationships becoming the heaviest, most burdensome weight on the entire plot?
So let's start at the foundation then. Let's analyze the severe structural problems that I think really plagued this entire season from the get-go.
Okay, let's unpack this structural failure, because the most immediate and, I'd say, pervasive critique from our sources is all about this idea of narrative bloat. Viewers kept using this one specific phrase: the series went full CW.
And that full CW reference, it's so telling, isn't it? It's shorthand for a specific kind of show, like Arrow with a Flash,
right?
Where you have this really focused, tight premise at the start, but then it just dissolves because the cast grows and grows and grows, and you're left with what the critics are just bluntly calling crap writing.
So it's not just about having more people on stream.
No, not at all. It's that the style of writing fundamentally shifts. It becomes about cheap melodrama, constant pairing and unpairing of characters, and it prioritizes this repetitive romantic drama over, the actual plot moving forward.
Which leads directly to character saturation. When you have this many main and secondary characters, the symptom of that bloat is that the writers literally, and this is a quote, don't know or don't have time what to do with all of them.
And you end up with this huge ensemble where half the cast just feels like glorified side characters. They're barely pushing the central conflict forward.
And the biggest victim cited here, again and again, was Mike Wheeler.
Absolutely. Mike was supposed to be the emotional anchor, right? The leader in the D&D sense, the group's planner and protector. And this season, viewers just accused him of essentially not doing a thing.
He became a prop.
A complete prop. He was relegated to this damsel in distress love interest role, just there to serve Eleven's emotional arc. And this isn't some minor issue. It fundamentally dismantles the internal logic of the group dynamic they spent 4 seasons building.
If the planner isn't planning and the protector isn't protecting,
then why is he even there? It feels like his role was just gutted.
And that reduction, you combine that with the sheer volume of other characters we're going to talk about, Holly Wheeler, Kali, it really just suggests a profound, maybe exhaustion in the writer's room.
And this saturation, it directly fuels the second major structural complaint: the dialogue problem.
Yes.
If you have too many characters and not enough actual plot, you have to fill that space with something. And what they filled it with was conversations that are supposed to sound deep, but which viewers just experienced as unnecessarily long dialogue.
In a final season that's supposed to be about an imminent apocalypse, you had viewers saying the dialogue felt like it had, and I love this, more walking and talking than LOTR.
Which is an incredible indictment when you think about it. The entire Lord of the Rings trilogy is built around long journeys and existential conversations.
But the real kicker, the cultural comparison that just speaks volumes about how artificial it all felt, was people likening entire dialogue scenes to a Darman video.
That analogy is both brilliant and deeply, deeply damaging for the show.
Explain that for anyone who might not know.
Darman videos are these, short internet videos structured around really simplistic, heavy-handed moral lessons. They sacrifice realism for the message every single time. So when the Stranger Things dialogue feels like that, it means it exists purely to lecture the audience, or to summarize feelings, or to force some thematic takeaway.
Instead of just being an organic, believable interaction between friends who we've known for years.
Exactly. It felt mandated. It felt like the writers were talking through the characters, not writing for them.
And the end result, we have countless reports from users saying they had to actively fast forward through this cringe dialogue just to get back to the action. The audience is literally performing the editor's job for them.
That forced fast forwarding is the clearest signal you can get that the pacing has just suffered terribly, which, leads us right to the core contradiction that viewers identified. The systemic, baffling lack of urgency.
Yes. This is where the writing just actively and, I'd say, spectacularly sabotages its own stakes. You have characters who are supposedly facing the world ending in minutes, maybe even seconds.
The clock is ticking, loudly.
And yet they stop everything for these lengthy, often repetitive emotional conversations. They're prioritizing the need for some emotional resolution over their immediate physical survival. It's a total failure of emotional pacing.
And the prime example, the one that came up over and over in the sources, the moment where this structural failure just became blindingly obvious, is that scene with Max and Holly inside Vecna's mindscape.
Okay, let's set the scene for everyone. Max and Holly are right next to the exit portal. It's their one window to escape. But they just stand there talking for what viewers estimated was 10-ish minutes.
An eternity in monster time.
And Max waits until the absolute last second when the portal is visibly shrinking to reveal this crucial piece of information to Holly about how to escape.
The collective audience experience was just, people were screaming at the TV to run. That shared visceral anxiety is a clear sign that the pacing was fundamentally broken.
The emotional moment just didn't land. It couldn't.
Because the physical danger was too immediate and too obvious. If a character chooses to emotionally process a complex issue when a monster is literally breathing down their neck, the writing is prioritizing melodrama over basic common sense.
And the debate around the scene is fascinating because some viewers did try to rationalize it.
They did. The argument was that Max realized she never needed the physical sound of the music to escape, only her connection to Lucas. So therefore, the threat of the portal closing wasn't the real issue.
So she was delaying to gain some kind of insight, not just wasting time.
But if the scene's emotional weight relies on the audience, just assuming that Max has solved this life or death physics problem off screen, that's not narrative genius. That's just a failure of communication.
As one viewer put it, Max's final admission that she had no idea that would work just made it seem like she was bullshitting the entire time, which completely destroys the emotional impact.
It suggests she intentionally risked Holly's life for a therapy session. It highlights this critical flaw.
Yeah.
You can't spend 10 minutes justifying an emotional connection when the monster is right there.
The moment needed to be quick, decisive, and integrated into the action, not separated from it.
And that failure to integrate emotional beats organically just extends directly to other relationship moments. Perhaps none more awkward and structurally compromised than that infamous Nancy and Jonathan scene, what viewers universally nicknamed the unproposal controversy.
This conversation was cited over and over as being so poorly written, so deliberately vague, that just mass confusion ensued. Given the high stakes, the immediate danger, many viewers genuinely believed Jonathan was proposing marriage.
Which, in the moment, makes a certain kind of desperate sense, a final gesture before they go into a battle they might not survive.
Exactly. But the structural indictment here, the real proof of failure, came when the ambiguity was so severe that the Duffer brothers allegedly had to release a public statement confirming that the scene was, in fact, a breakup.
Just think about that. When the creators of a massive series have to retroactively clarify whether a major emotional beat was a proposal or a separation, it confirms a profound flaw in the writing. The scene just completely failed.
Okay, so let's zoom in on the thematic critique that was layered on top of this failure. The stated reason for the breakup, Nancy wanting to prioritize her career, her independence after Hawkins, it felt incredibly forced to a lot of viewers.
Yeah, the criticism suggested this felt like a narrative mandate, like the relationship's resolution was being made subservient to an external message, which led some critics to suggest Netflix was pushing, a specific woke ideology or feminist propaganda.
But let's look at that objectively. How can we tell the difference between an organic character evolution, Nancy naturally deciding she wants independence, and a narrative mandate that just feels forced?
It all comes down to setup. It's about earning the moment. If Nancy's desire for independence had been a growing, visible tension throughout the season, reflected in smaller arguments or actions, the breakup would have felt earned.
But it wasn't.
Not at all. It arrived late, it was heavily verbalized, and it was highly ambiguous. It suggests the writers just needed to eliminate the relationship quickly to set Nancy up for whatever's next, and they just forced the explanation into one rushed, confusing scene.
When a character's decision feels arbitrary or like it's serving an agenda rather than their own history, the audience just loses faith in the whole story.
Which brings us to the scene that generated arguably the most intense and widespread reaction of all Will Byers coming out. This moment perfectly encapsulates the deep conflict between thematic intent and structural execution.
Absolutely. The scene was positioned as this major emotional centerpiece. It was clearly intended to be pivotal. The setup is Will calling a gathering moments before the final battle against Vecna, telling Mike that everyone needs to hear this.
And let's start with the plot rationale, because the intent here was complex and thematic. The sources confirm the confession was intended to overcome his shame and insecurity.
And the reasoning is rooted in the show's lore, right?
Exactly. Vecna preys on and uses dark secrets and shame to control his victims. So, in theory, Will's powers and his ability to fight Vecna are directly tied to his self-acceptance. By speaking his truth, he takes that weapon away from Vecna.
So it's this idea that the power of love and self-acceptance can overcome the power of fear. Philosophically, that's perfectly sound. It aligns with the show's overall message. And for some people, the scene was genuinely emotionally cathartic.
The overwhelming dominant criticism focused relentlessly on the structural failure of the timing and the scope of it all. It just made the entire premise feel irrelevant to the immediate crisis.
The who cares reaction just completely dominated the discourse. People are actively preparing for an apocalyptic battle, and Will's sexuality, while personally very important, just felt entirely mistimed.
The critiques were brutal. Things like 15 minutes lost over that reveal and the perfectly succinct, not the time, man. It just stopped the narrative cold right when the momentum should have been peaking.
And compounding that timing issue was the widespread feeling that the reveal was entirely redundant.
Yes. Viewers felt the ambiguity had been resolved years ago. Some said season 1, some said season 3. But it led them to conclude, pretty harshly, that the writers think their audience is stupid if they needed such a bombastic late-stage announcement.
The intimacy was gone because everyone watching already knew.
It's just a classic execution failure. As one commenter pointed out, this should have been an intimate scene between him and his mother, and maybe Jonathan.
Especially Jonathan, since he'd already expressed unconditional acceptance back in season 4. He was the natural person for Will to talk to.
But instead of that intimacy, Will gathers this small gathering of the main people, which unbelievably just bloated the moment with characters who were minimally connected to him. We're talking about Murray.
Mr. Clark, his physics teacher.
Mr. Clark. And even Collier 8, who we barely even know and the audience actively disliked.
Why did the physics teacher need to be there for this deeply personal moment right before the world ends? It made a crucial emotional beat feel like forced public exposure. It sacrificed genuine character connection for the appearance of a major scene.
And this circles back perfectly to that universal, non-political critique. It transcended all the debates about woke agendas versus homophobic accusations. The prevailing sentiment was simply that the scene was cringe, corny, and just plain awkward.
Which suggests a profound misjudgment of tone and structure by the creators, regardless of how valid the message was.
It failed structurally because it needed to be seeded earlier. It needed to breathe in a quiet moment, and it needed to be tied more clearly into his ongoing private struggle with Vecna. As presented, it just arrives late, disrupts the flow, and feels like a heavy-handed statement the writers needed to make before they could get to the action.
And the performance in that scene, particularly Noah Schnapp's acting, also came under some intense scrutiny. We saw some pretty conflicting views on this.
Some viewers were very harsh. They labeled Schnapp one of the worst actors and argued that his reliance on crying or overacting to death doesn't actually equate to good acting. They just found the performance overwrought.
And yet, others defended him. They shifted the blame entirely back to the writers.
Right. Their argument was that any weak performance was because he was trapped in unfinished arcs, unclear emotional direction, broken pacing, and poor narrative continuity. They're essentially saying the writing was so weak, so awkward, that even the most skilled actor would struggle to make that moment land naturally.
If the material itself is inherently awkward and mistimed, the actors really put in an impossible position.
Exactly. And this is why critics immediately pointed to Robin's coming out scene in season 3 with Steve as the correct model.
And that scene worked precisely because it was quick, it was intimate, and it felt entirely organic to their established dynamic. It cemented their friendship, it used their shared history, and it delivered its emotional payoff without halting the entire plot for some self-contained, lengthy declaration.
The contrast between that subtle, earned moment and Will's grand, awkward staging just highlights the perceived failure here.
Okay, so moving beyond just the structural pacing, the next layer of criticism seems to involve this chronic character mismanagement and some really confusing lore updates. When a cast is this large, every misplaced character minute is noticeable.
Oh, yeah, and the source material is just filled with complaints about underutilized heroes and overutilized side players.
Let's revisit Mike Wheeler first. We mentioned his reduction earlier, but it's worth noting just how severe it was. Mike, the supposed glue of the group, was almost completely sidelined.
He was. The audience critique focuses on the fact that he was rendered entirely passive. He was just reacting to 11 rather than driving any action himself. He's supposed to be the strategist, the one who navigates the group, but in the final battle he had no strategic role, no major discovery, nothing.
Just emotional support.
That's it. And the reduction was so jarring that there was this pervasive rumor that Mike's entire plot was severely cut. Viewers felt that was the only logical explanation for his sudden irrelevance.
Then we have the supposed protagonist, 11. Even she didn't escape this character management crisis. Some viewers felt she was barely in the show this volume, which is incredible considering the conflict revolves around her.
And beyond just her screen time, many found her acting distracting. They specifically cited her perpetual expression, which they crudely nicknamed the same glare face, or the smell of fart face.
Which is highly critical, but it reflects a real audience disconnection. They felt her emotional responses were repetitive and one note.
And then on top of that, our sources noted these speculative cosmetic critiques. Allegations that she had visible cosmetic changes, like lip fillers or Botox. Now, we don't get into personal critique, but the key insight here is that for some viewers, this physical shift broke their suspension of disbelief.
It pulled them out of the character's journey. It made her look less like a battle-worn 80s teen and more like a glossy Hollywood figure.
And the character bloat led to even more confusing choices, like the return of Kali, or 8. After her heavily disliked Season 2 episode, The Lost Sister, her return here felt forced and, according to critics, absolutely useless.
So what was her function? What did she even do?
Primarily exposition dumping. She required 11 to listen to her whole life story and then explain that she and the other numbers have to sacrifice themselves because they have Vecna's blood. It was just a massive info dump delivered by a character the audience has zero investment in.
It's the clumsiest form of storytelling. You just stop the action so an unnecessary character can deliver plot points the main cast should have discovered on their own.
The only thing that generated any interest was a fan theory that Kali might be a secret Vecna agent. A compelling idea that the show completely failed to capitalize on.
But maybe the strangest character critique, the one that highlights the utterly skewed screen time priorities, focuses on Holly Wheeler, Mike and Nancy's younger sister.
Right. Critics noted that this young, ostensibly unimportant character had more screen time than half the main cast in the final season.
Which led to this rampant speculation, completely unsubstantiated, but fascinating as a measure of audience frustration, that she might be a Nepo baby being promoted by the studio.
It just illustrates how frustrated the audience was with the allocation of time when core characters like Mike were doing literally nothing.
Okay, let's pivot from character bloat to a more foundational problem. The lore, confusion, and continuity errors that just shattered the established world building. The way the Upside Down was defined suddenly shifted.
This is a major betrayal of the established canon. For years, the Upside Down was presented as the darker mirror image of Hawkins, frozen in time on the day Will was taken.
It was personal. It was creepy.
Exactly. This season, however, new exposition redefined it as a bridge or a wormhole to something much grander and more abstract. Dimension X, or the Abyss.
Which just confused viewers because it completely contradicts the premise of the setting. It feels like a total retcon.
And the complexity didn't stop there. Dustin finds a journal with information about this dimension's stability being maintained by exotic matter.
Okay, break that down for us.
So, in theoretical physics, exotic matter is often associated with negative mass, which can push against gravitational collapse. The lore suggested this matter was keeping the wormhole open. But introducing this highly technical last-minute scientist journal just felt like a rushed attempt to give a scientific framework to something that always worked better as pure, unexplained horror.
The most glaring lore hole, though, had to be the absence of the Mind Flayer.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
For 2 seasons, the Mind Flayer was built up as this huge cosmic threat, a being of pure, unfathomable horror, an eater of worlds. To have the final battle focus entirely on Vecna, a deformed human, felt like a severe, almost insulting letdown.
The distinction is crucial, isn't it?
It is. Vecna is a man, Henry Creel, who gained powers and was deformed. He's a human monster driven by human jealousy and rage. The Mind Flayer was supposed to be Cthulhu, a godlike entity. Switching the final boss from a cosmic horror to a man, no matter how powerful, just fundamentally reduces the scale of the threat.
A lot of viewers are still holding out hope that the Mind Flayer is the true villain behind it all.
And if the finale fails to address that, the payoff will feel incredibly diminished.
And further aggravating all these continuity errors is the canonical inclusion of the stage play, The First Shadow.
Right, this external material, which is optional for the audience, created a massive plot hole. It showed Henry Creel in high school living a relatively normal teen life.
Which directly contradicts Season 4's claim that he was held in Brenner's lab since he was 12.
When you rely on optional media to provide critical lore, and that lore conflicts with the TV show, it just damages the experience for the general audience and reveals a real lack of cohesive planning.
And finally, a detail that just perfectly captures this idea that the writers were so focused on the emotional microdramas that they forgot the macro stakes. The forgotten victims.
A darkly humorous, but narratively sloppy point. The sources noted that the Turnbow family, who were tied up in a barn as a plot complication, were just completely forgotten.
By the characters and the writers.
They were just left there, tied up. A loose thread dangling into the abyss, confirming that the writers just dropped the ball on managing basic narrative continuity.
Which brings us to the ultimate existential threat to the series' reputation, the crisis of stakes. If the audience doesn't believe anyone can actually die, all the tension just evaporates.
Viewers complain bitterly about zero stakes due to what they called fucking plot armor. Characters are constantly shot, slashed, melted, put in inescapable traps, but they inevitably survive through these increasingly contrived means. That predictability just removes all genuine suspense.
The predictability was so severe that many commenters actually said they wanted Vecna to win.
Or for some main characters, like Nancy or Jonathan, to die. And it's not out of malice toward the characters. It's out of a desperate need to restore narrative stakes and prevent what they feared would be a predictable, very Disney ending where everyone gets a tidy, happy resolution.
This plot armor fatigue is particularly acute with Hopper, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. His continuous resurrection across past seasons, Season 2, Season 3, Season 4, it just makes any attempt at a final sacrifice feel entirely contrived and meaningless. The audience just assumes he'll reappear in a Russian prison or somehow walk out of the Upside Down.
His heroism is completely undermined by his constant unnecessary survival.
Given all these pervasive writing issues, the pacing, the bloat, the lore confusion, many viewers began to suspect that external issues were to blame. And this is where the production rumors really start to gain traction.
Right. There are these persistent, widespread rumors that Netflix cut over 2 hours of content from Volume 2.
And this theory is used by viewers to explain almost every structural flaw we've discussed. The rushed feeling, the underdeveloped plot threads like the Mind Flayer, the abrupt character inconsistencies. A significant cut would certainly explain why the season felt simultaneously bloated with dialogue, yet rushed in its resolution.
And on top of that, the writing decline has reinvigorated these persistent, years-old rumors about plagiarism lawsuits against the Duffer Brothers.
And we have to be impartial here, but the sources indicate that critics argued the dramatic drop in quality writing serves as circumstantial evidence for the claim that the creators had no original thought beyond the initial, arguably borrowed concept.
Whether it's true or not, the perceived decline in quality makes these negative narratives stick.
And this toxic combination, rushed pacing, unresolved plots, poor dialogue, character mismanagement, and the collapse of stakes, it all culminates in the most feared outcome for any major franchise: the Game of Thrones comparison.
That comparison is not made lightly. It is the ultimate narrative dread.
Viewers see the exact same pattern. A strong early series built on character and mystery, gradually ballooning in scope, and then sacrificing logical progression for quick, mandated plot points. The dread is that the Stranger Things finale will follow the disastrous path of Game of Thrones Season 8, where a strong foundation is retroactively ruined by a deeply unsatisfying ending.
And the result of that dread is that viewers feel invested but obligated to finish the story.
And that obligation, watching simply because you've invested this much time and emotional energy rather than genuine excitement, that is the most damning sign of narrative fatigue. The creators have lost the goodwill of the audience, and they now risk completing the story on sheer inertia.
Before we conclude, though, we have to end on a positive note. Because despite all the chaos of Volume 2, there was one element that receives universal, unreserved praise. It served as a clear counterpoint to all the failures we've just discussed.
That would be the dynamic between Steve and Dustin. Across almost all the sources, this duo was cited as the saving grace, the element that made the show bearable for so many. They were a constant reminder of what the show could achieve when the writing was tight and the connection was earned.
Their bond was cited as the one area where the acting and writing truly excelled. It felt organic, rooted in years of history. Specifically, that emotional fight thug sequence between them in the lab was just lauded as a great acting.
It was a perfect, nuanced representation of a complex male friendship.
Why did that particular scene work so flawlessly when so many others failed?
Because it was intimate, it was earned, and it accurately reflected the realistic cycle of male communication. Tension, a brief flare-up, resolution, and then ultimately unconditional support. It avoided the contrived, overly verbalized melodrama that plagued so many other character interactions.
It proves the writers are still capable of it when they keep the focus tight and true to the characters. So, what does this all mean? Let's try to summarize the findings of this deep dive. Our analysis reveals a pretty clear consensus among critics. While the foundational concept of Stranger Things is still compelling, the execution of Volume 2 failed due to these deep structural flaws.
Poor pacing, crippling character bloat, and the repeated insertion of major yet awkward emotional moments at the expense of narrative flow and suspense.
And the numerous plot holes, the mind flare, the Turnbow family, the lore retcons, coupled with the reliance on external materials like the stage play and the looming threat of spin-offs like Tales from 85. It really suggests that the upcoming 2-hour finale may not have nearly enough time to resolve everything.
There's a legitimate concern that the final 90 minutes of story will be severely constrained by the need for a 30-minute epilogue, just to tie up all the loose domestic knots.
And here is where we circle back to that core thematic intent. And this raises a really interesting and provocative final thought for you, the listener. We saw that Max found her humanity and escaped Vecna's mind by connecting with Lucas. We saw Will seek to empower himself by connecting through his confession to his friends.
The writing team clearly heavily focused on strengthening these human bonds and emotional releases during the apocalypse.
So the question becomes, did that focus on strengthening human connections become so paramount? Did the drive to deliver major emotional beats for every single character inadvertently lead the writing team to fail to maintain the compelling monstrosity of the threat?
By dedicating so much valuable runtime to internal emotional struggles during moments of imminent external danger, did they prioritize character therapy over terror? And in doing so, did they ultimately sacrifice the genuine suspense and dread that defined the show's early success? That is the final structural irony viewers have to reckon with as they approach the end.
We're diving immediately into the structural controversies around Stranger Things Season 5, Volume 2. The decision to interrupt a high-stakes climax with these moments of deep personal dialogue, often dismissed by audiences as yap sessions, has created a massive rift in the reception.
And it's a perfect illustration of that classic conflict between, character fulfillment and structural integrity. The core of the issue really centers on scenes of extended emotional resolution that arrive right when the characters should be, executing their final plan against Vecna.
Right. So the central question we're facing today is this. Was the decision to include these extended emotionally charged scenes, specifically Will Byers coming out, was that a justifiable narrative imperative, something essential to resolve key character arcs and, maybe more importantly, to strategically neutralize the villain?
And I'm going to argue that regardless of its powerful thematic intention, the execution represented a pretty significant structural failure. It's due to a crippling temporal misalignment that severely damaged the momentum you need for a series climax.
Okay, so I'll be representing the position that these scenes, particularly Will's, were a plot precondition, a non-negotiable step that was necessary to arm Will against Vecna.
And I'll be arguing that the timing and the composition of that scene fundamentally failed the narrative engineering of the entire final volume.
I see why that perceived slowdown felt disruptive, but we have to start by examining the central threat. Vecna is not a monster that can be defeated purely by, firepower. He is a psychic, mind game villain who explicitly preys on a victim's deepest secrets and greatest fears.
Acknowledged. The narrative absolutely establishes that he weaponizes internal shame.
Precisely. And for Will, his greatest vulnerability wasn't just physical danger. It was the profound shame and fear of isolation that was associated with revealing his sexuality, particularly in the restrictive social climate of 1980s Indiana. This secret, it was a massive exploitable psychic vulnerability.
Okay, I agree that resolving this fear is the logical capstone to Will's long-running character journey. I think we can all agree on that. But the conceptual need for a resolution is completely separate from the structural placement of that resolution.
I would frame that differently. In the internal logic of the Upside Down, overcoming this deep-seated fear and revealing his secret wasn't just, character development. It was an essential psychological defense mechanism. It was necessary to, as some viewers put it, strengthen his mind and prevent Vecna from using that specific anchor to control or destroy him. If Will is the sorcerer, if he's central to the psychic war, he needed a clear mind to unlock his full utility. The resolution of this arc becomes a genuine plot prerequisite for him to engage in the final battle effectively. You cannot face the ultimate psychological manipulator while you're hiding the key to your own destruction.
I just don't buy the defense that a plot requirement dictates poor execution. We're discussing a failure of temporal urgency. Experts and viewers alike, they all noted the scene arrived too late and it took way too long. We're estimating 10 to 15 minutes were dedicated to this emotional confession, while the primary characters were supposed to be finalizing their literal world-saving plan. The critical failure here is the imposition of an internal, sort of psychological necessity over the external narrative urgency. You should clear up personal baggage after the devil is defeated, not while the clock is ticking.
But what if the internal baggage is the source of the devil's power? In that case, clearing it is the prerequisite. It's a chicken and egg scenario, I'll grant you, but the writers chose to prioritize the internal logic of Vecna's weakness.
And that choice led directly to a structural failure that, for many people, broke immersion. When audiences are compelled to fast forward through what you're calling necessary dialogue, because the timing just feels so fundamentally wrong, that signals a flaw in the narrative engineering. It's not just a preference for faster pacing. It signals poor direction that turns a poignant thematic moment into something that just feels, cringe and stops the action dead in its tracks.
Okay, that brings us logically to the composition of the scene itself. You argue that instead of being an intimate moment of fortification, it became an overly exposed and exposition dump.
Precisely. If the point was psychological defense, Will securing the acceptance of his most crucial support system that should primarily involve his mother and brother, right? Joyce and Jonathan. But the scene included the entire assembled group. His family, Mike, Murray, and even Mr. Clark.
Let's briefly contextualize Mr. Clark for the listener. He's the science teacher, a figure of sort of intellectual grounding for the kids.
Exactly. He's ancillary to Will's emotional core. Their presence, whether it was intentional or not, it diluted the raw power of Will's vulnerability. It transformed a potential heart-to-heart into this crowded group acceptance ritual, and in doing so, it wasted crucial screen time that was needed for preparing for the climax. Why share this intensely personal, intimate moment with every available character when the world is crumbling?
I would actually frame the inclusion of the entire group as strategically brilliant. Vecna's method is isolation. His psychic attack is built on Will's belief that he is alone and that his identity is a source of profound shame. To truly defeat that psychic weapon, Will couldn't just tell one person. He needed to completely neutralize the shame by receiving acceptance from his entire found family all at once. The community, the whole collective, becomes the ultimate shield against Vecna's method. This wasn't about wasting time. It was about maximizing the efficacy of the psychological armor he needed to build.
That thematic argument, it holds up, but the problem of temporal misalignment, it isn't just isolated to Will's scene. It points to a broader structural issue in Volume 2 that's defined by these unnecessarily long dialogue scenes, these yap sessions that consistently undermine the narrative urgency.
What specific scenes demonstrate this broader structural drift for you?
Oh, we can look at two clear examples. First, that unproposal scene between Nancy and Jonathan. This was intended to be a resolution of their long-distance relationship tension. And yet, The writing was so muddled and confusing that the showrunners later had to clarify that it was actually a breakup, not a proposal, which is how many viewers initially interpreted it.
So the flaw there was clarity, not necessarily length.
It was both. If a crucial emotional resolution, one intended to clear the air before a final battle, is so poorly executed that it confuses the audience and stalls the momentum, it's a structural failure. It halts their individual arcs, taking time that should have been spent on strategic preparation, and it just leaves the audience more confused than resolved.
I see why you'd think that line of reasoning highlights a lack of precision. But let me offer you a different perspective on that dialogue length. Dialogue-heavy moments, even the ones perceived as slow, are often essential for grounding the characters in their reality right before they face an unimaginable threat. They serve as the final anchor point before all the chaos.
And what about the Max and Holly scene? Max is delayed running towards safety, pausing to explain these complex emotional concepts about her mental fortitude to a minor character while Vecna is actively closing in on her. The temporal pressure is immense, yet the scene treats it like a therapy session. I think the audience's patience just snaps when a character actively delays running from danger to engage in a protracted, expositional conversation.
But this is exactly where the show elevates the thematic stakes above the purely physical ones. The argument is that internal resolve is the greatest weapon. Max later demonstrates she found her strength in Lucas, not in her music. But that clarity had to be established through deep, albeit lengthy, dialogue. The structure dictates that emotional readiness is preparation. The focus shifts from the ticking clock to the character's internal state, reinforcing the idea that they cannot win the physical war without first winning the psychic one.
And yet, the structural contrast within the show itself proves that this level of bloat was unnecessary. Robin's coming out scene in Season 3 is universally cited as a masterfully executed, efficient, and successful piece of writing. It was intimate, it was meaningful, it resolved her arc, and crucially, it didn't hijack the surrounding plot or break the tension.
That is a compelling comparison, I'll give you that, though I would counter that Will's situation carries this immense, unique plot weight that Robin's personal story did not require. The high investment in Will's scene is justified by its strategic role.
You're asserting it's a strategic plot maneuver, but you need to demonstrate how. If the structural cost is so high, the benefit must be equally massive and, clearly defined.
The benefit is tied directly to the established rules of the Upside Down. Will is the foundational sorcerer. He's the psychic link between Hawkins and Vecna, retaining his bond even after Eleven severed the gate. That shame, that massive secret, it functions as a psychic tether for Vecna to continually exploit Will's subconscious and use him as an unwitting censor. When Will accepts himself, he isn't just feeling better about himself, he is deliberately severing that specific emotional anchor.
So what you're arguing is it's essentially a magical purification ritual.
Functionally, yes. It is the literal trigger for his final utility in the climax. It allows him to use his unique psychic vulnerability as a strength against Vecna, without being corrupted by his deepest fear. This moment of self-acceptance immediately frees up his power and clarity for the confrontation. Robin's confession was interpersonal, and it was beautiful. Will's confession is a strategic weaponization of vulnerability. The stakes justify the length, even if the result felt a little theatrical.
And yet, that structural choice to make it theatrical and long is precisely what earned it the criticism of being corny and cringe. If a necessary plot device is executed so poorly that it invites the audience to emotionally disengage and fast forward, then its necessity becomes irrelevant. The craft failed the concept. The tension and urgency required for a season finale were sacrificed on the altar of character closure.
It seems we're left wrestling with that fundamental tension between plot function and pacing. I'd summarize my position by reasserting that the function of the scene to proactively arm Will with self-acceptance against Vecna's specialized psychological attack is a clear and compelling narrative imperative. It is the essential, hard-earned payoff for a character who has been central to the plot since the very beginning.
And I'll summarize by asserting that the imperative of a character beat does not excuse the failure of its structural execution. The excessive length, the inappropriate timing right before the world ended, and the needlessly crowded composition of the scene fatally undermined its potential emotional impact and broke the core tension of the climax. I think the material demonstrates that in a high-stakes scenario, sacrificing structural momentum for emotional resolution, however important that resolution is, carries a severe, severe cost.
This ongoing tension, the challenge of ensuring every major character receives proper emotional closure while simultaneously maintaining the relentless urgency of a world-ending plot, is the constant tightrope walk for large-scale ensemble narratives. The material here really shows the dramatic cost of prioritizing that internal necessity over external momentum.
Indeed. It forces the audience to consider if the deep emotional payoff for Will was truly worth the significant sacrifice in pacing and structural integrity for the entire final arc. There is clearly much more to explore in how these complex narrative choices land with viewers under that kind of peak temporal pressure.
If you enjoy this video, please like, share, subscribe and hit the bell to the latest update from my channel. Thank you for watching till the end and see you in the next video.